you're saying that the challenges made to Horizon are a figment of guilty thieves' imagination, and it's the only thing they can come up with when they know they're guilty and they've stolen the money. That's what you're saying by that sentence, isn't it?
Well, we had, right from the inception of Horizon, experienced defendants saying, it wasn't me, it was the system, yet they plead guilty. And that's part of something that I couldn't understand, why somebody who was saying, I'm effectively innocent, would ever plead guilty.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a recovering public servant on Kaurna land. Joining me today are my two colleagues in recovery, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison. Greetings from the other side.
This episode, we are going to return where we began Season 2 with the UK Post Office scandal. Put briefly, in this scandal, over the period of nearly 2 decades, Post Office used information from an unreliable computer system called Horizon to prosecute around 1,000 sub-postmasters for theft when the computer said that their shops showed shortfalls.
Sorry,
it's now
that was
the
called
subject
alliteration.
of a multi-year inquiry in the UK, a hit TV series called Post Office and Mr. Bates, or V Mr. Bates if you're American, and most recently an extraordinary piece of legislation overturning the convictions of everyone prosecuted by the Post Office and Crown Prosecution Services in England and in Wales between 23 September 1996 and 31 December 2018. In previous episodes, we started in the mid-90s to understand how the Post Office bought a lemon of an IT system and then promptly forgot how terrible it was. We finished up in about 2006, 6 years after the rollout of Horizon. So in this mini-series of episodes, Caroline's going to take us through the following decade or so, covering both the prosecution of sub-postmasters as well as the way Post Office responded to an increasing chorus of concerns about those prosecutions. Caroline, take us away.
Look, so I think I went back and listened to our last episode, and I think we finished by saying, look, it's not a corporate crime to purchase a crappy IT system or even to pretend to your staff that that crappy IT system is better than it is to help change management. And if it was, I think we would all be in jail. But where this story actually gets real is in the prosecutions, because it is a corporate crime and it is a travesty of justice to prosecute people for something they didn't do. And so, like, a key part of this story and something very familiar to us is the real power imbalance between sub-postmasters and Post Office. So I thought I might just start by revisiting the nature of the relationship. Sub-postmasters were essentially franchisees. There's over 10,000, at its peak around 17,000 around the country. And the contract that they have with Post Office is incredibly archaic and incredibly one-sided. And in fact, in 2019, Justice Fraser will find in the Common Issues trial that the contract is so unfair as to be void in various elements. So, wow. Yeah, right. So clauses like that hold a sub-postmaster strictly liable for all discrepancies, save a robbery. Nice of them to let that one go.
That's not your fault. The guy with the gun, we'll rule that out. But other than
everything
that,
else is your fault.
Yours. Allowing Post Office to suspend sub-postmasters without pay, without giving good reason. That sounds fun. Allowing Post Office to terminate a sub-postmaster for any breach of contract. You use the blue pen, not the red, not just the big ones. And providing that a sub-postmaster is not entitled to any compensation in the event that they're terminated. So their £100,000 investment is not in any way compensated. So,
and I'm sure in bright lights at the bottom was all of the various appeals process and the support and the mechanisms there with
Just
which
like
to
at the bottom of the Robojet letters, there were definitely ways that you could,
Well, I mean, brilliantly, many people hadn't actually seen the contract to which they were bound. So, you know, like wives whose husbands had signed up to be sub-postmasters and then who died or went into aged care homes, they take it over, they never sign a contract, and then they're prosecuted on the basis of the contract.
I've got questions about that, but keep going.
Well, indeed, so did Justice Fraser. You could join him. They also, like, Post Office also did this brilliant thing where not only was the contract terrible, they just asserted a whole bunch of stuff existed in the contract that didn't. The most significant of which was that they automatically treated any shortfalls as a debt, not just those caused by negligence, which is actually what the original contract said. And Justice Fraser finds, again, this is completely void and bunk. The final thing I'll say about the contract before we kind of reflect on how wacky and imbalanced that is that Justice Fraser finds that contrary to what Post Office say this contract is, which is an agent relationship, actually these are relational contracts, which I'd never heard of until like the NDIS review maybe like 2 months ago, and I've been nodding along and pretending.
I've still never heard of them, so just maybe would you like to explain them to me?
This makes me feel better because for 2 months in my day job, I've been like, oh yeah, relational contracts. I know what that is. Anyway, a relational contract, I now know, is one in which there is an implied term of good faith. So in any contract, there's a implication that you will act honestly, but in a relational contract, there's an implication that you will refrain from conduct considered commercially unacceptable by reasonable and honest people. Crazy. Okay. Anyway, Post Office didn't think they had a good faith duty to their sub-postmasters who were running their business, and it turns out they did. So this is the background, and I was thinking about this from like a public service perspective. I actually find it hard outside of like group home settings, like outside of kind of institutional people living in them settings, to think of a public service context where the power imbalance is so clearly out of whack. Can you guys think of any?
I can think of quite a few. The first one that I always think of in relation to contracts and power imbalance is the amount of time in my late 20s and early 30s I spent wondering if I could void my HECS debt on the basis that I had just turned 17 and was unable to sign any other type of like contract. When I started, yes, I was a little girl when I went to university. Yes, I was granted. However, I was 17 and I got a stack of forms, like, do you want the hard copy textbook? Are you going to borrow it? You went through them. And I, even as a 17-year-old, you'll be shocked to discover, was reasonably administratively nerdy and actually read it. But equally, like the front of the uni book said uni in Australia is free. And later on you might have to, like, it was very kind of, and then the HECS form was just give us your tax file number. Oh, okay, here's your tax file number and sign it. When I was unable to get a home loan and was looking at that coming out every fortnight and scraping it together in my 20s, I was like, I don't remember. Like, I remember how long I thought about that $2,500 car. I remember about borrowing half of it. I remember wondering if I could pay back. I remember no due diligence that went into this decision to sign up for this enormous amount of debt. And, of course, it was less debt than young people have today. So I have – so and at the same time, if you go to the 90s, was the 90s and early O's, the bonded scholarships, particularly in medicine, that the Howard government did, where, again, I have a number of friends who were 17, one who was 16 and a half, yep, shout out to the nerdy precocious university starters, who signed up to when they got a Medicare provider number, which for people who did really specialist training was like close to 30, bonded themselves for many years to be in a regional or rural area. By then they had children and dying parents or like all of this stuff that when they were 17 they were like, oh, well, yeah, no, I'm okay, sure, I'll be a doctor in the country as long as I get to be a doctor. Those contracts, I think those contracts have been tested, so I wouldn't want to go to it. But even those contracts, you have to wonder about how a 17-year-old can decide that 12 years from now I'm going to go and move to a regional area and work and I will be bonded. And the thing about those contracts was you couldn't just give them the money back.
Yeah.
So there was nothing in those contracts that said, oh, whoops, actually I don't want to do that. Here, I understand that you lowered my HEX or helped me out, gave me extra study. Here, have your money back. I've gone and taken out a loan. I'm going to keep working. So there were people who couldn't work regionally because their specialisms were so small that there was no such thing as a such and such specialist.
Do the regional practice.
Oh my God.
So they are two where I just go, I just wonder. My daughter will be 17 when she starts university and signs hers, and I just wonder about that. I think that's probably a little bit of an outlier. I think the thing that's most interesting about this one in particular is how many jobs we turned into businesses across the Western world. So I think it's really interesting, and I think that here in Australia is really easy.
What do you
go to
mean?
the NDIS. Well, if you go to the NDIS, a number of people who would have been employed by a state government or even
Uber.
a large Uber, but I mean, I think disability is a really good one where there are lots of people who have to have an ABN who provide a service, and that then requires them potentially to have insurance and the things that were jobs where you turned up and paid, and it didn't mean you had no responsibility, didn't mean you could steal from the till or not abide by a code of ethics. But what we did was outsource government and said, now you have to run a business. And with that comes tax obligations, super obligations, a whole series of things. And you still have to abide by this code of ethics and this whatever. So you still had all the requirements of a job, but then all the requirements of but also the same level of requirements of much bigger businesses of 15 people, businesses that could afford an accountant or a lawyer or a whatever. And so I think the power imbalance here is more akin to what we've done when we've outsourced other types of social services, which is where we take things where you were employed and we turned them into businesses. And then with that we created all of this due diligence, but we still held all the power as government. So we were still paying the bill. We could stop paying you. If you look at the difference between, I'd imagine, contractually getting rid of us, leaving aside the clear illegality and weirdness of the arrangements that the post office had, but if you think about the performance management of a public service versus the termination of one of these contracts, like there are no protections built into them, and they were jobs. You used to have a job at the post office as the post office manager. So I think that's the power imbalance, is we turned jobs into businesses and then we said it's your problem to figure out your legal liability, and it's now your problem to figure out your financial liability.
Not public service, but these post office contracts remind me of the super exploitative record contracts, record deals that musicians used to get signed up to, maybe still do, you know, where just all the power and all the money is on one side of the equation and the other people are like, no, it's going to be good for me. But actually any interrogation of the detail, which they don't do, reveals that it's not.
Exactly that. So one of the consequences of the power imbalance in this context is one of Alison's most favourite occurrences, a reversal of the onus of proof. So this has significant impacts on prosecution because in a contractual sense, the reversal goes something like, we assume the discrepancy is your fault unless you prove it otherwise and you have to pay us back. So that's bad because, like, you're paying back money you don't owe. But it's worse when we say, we assume the discrepancy is your fault and we're going to send you to jail unless you can prove to us there's a problem with the system.
Which is absolutely the opposite of how the justice system is designed to operate. Which is to say that in any criminal prosecution, it is for the prosecution to make the case. The defendant doesn't have to do anything, show anything.
Unless you are a post office employee. So that's
apparently so, or a robo-debt victim.
Well,
but how?
Yeah. And so, look, that's what I thought we could spend this episode talking about is, like, how did they achieve this trick? I think one of the most important factors of how they achieve this trick is that, unlike a normal prosecution, it's a private prosecution, which gives you a sense of how old the post office is, right? Like, it's lost in the mists of hundreds of years ago when, you know, you couldn't rely on the sheriff of the bailiff of the whatever to do a thing. You had to go I don't know.
Look, it sounds to me like what
Sheriff of the bailiff of whatever is my new go-to phrase.
Well, see, but hearing that and thinking, this is that rabbit hole I've never been down that I want to, which is the law of the sea. I'm always confused. And listeners, Caroline just spat her water out. This is a genuinely impromptu podcast. The law of the sea. I've never understood how a captain of a ship is the same as a legal system. I know there are a whole series of rules, and I never did that unit at university, but I am fascinated as to how we can just make up things like a captain is now a judge and you can do private prosecutions because it's the Royal Mail, and in something happened and now we have private prosecutions.
That's exactly right. And so because of this, we lead to this very strange situation where Post Office is the victim of the crime, apparently, like it was their money that was stolen. They then investigate the crime, they work out who stole it, and then they prosecute it. Anyway, it's so brilliant.
So it's a lot like how small children resolve things.
Yes. So, look, here, let me
He
take...
stole it, here's my proof, and I believe
And now
we
I've
should be
bashed
sending-
him up.
Problem solved. I used a private prosecution process.
So, but like literally no checks and balances there, right?
No checks and balances. This is the challenge. Because, I mean, of course, even police don't do that many prosecutions. Usually there's the check and balance of DPP. But anyway, so path to prosecution. The Post Office branch is audited. This is where all prosecutions begin. Either it's kind of randomly or because they've been someone's noticed there are discrepancies. Now, auditor is a word that implies a skill set, and these are not these auditors. As the council,
Is this like private prosecution? Are we making things up?
we are making things up. The Inquiry Council sort of says, so essentially it's like a stock take clerk. And they're like, yes, we go in and we count the things and then we line it up against how many things the paper says there should be. That's what an audit is. So don't think this is fancy. And usually auditors come from people who have begun their career in Post Office. They've worked on the front line of a particular Crown office and they've it's like a promotion pathway. Over the 2000s, as they all reduce their workforce or whatever, the auditors come to be the same team and then the same people as the investigations. So you could see a little removal of things. So what the auditor spots a discrepancy, calls the regional manager, like the person who manages the contract, and says, hey, I can see £1,000 missing here. What should I do? Usually the regional manager says, you should suspend that person on the spot without pay and call in the investigators. So let's just have a little listen to hear how that went down as described by Helen Rose, who was the auditor in Lee Castleton's case, which is quite a famous case if you've been following it.
He clearly identified to you that he'd been having a problem with balancing.
Yes, clearly, yes.
He suggested to you that misbalances were due to a computer problem. Yes?
Yes, that's what it said, yes.
He told you that he'd been in contact with the helpline since right from the beginning and that he'd been in contact with his retail line manager, Kath Oglesby.
Yes.
Am I right to think that there's no investigation of what he is saying before he's suspended and an interim postmaster is brought in to run his post office? Instead, he's just suspended on the spot there and then.
As an auditor, you would pass that over to the retail line manager to make that decision.
But it all happened quite quickly on the day, did it?
I believe it did, yes.
And is that typical of how things worked at this time? It didn't matter if the sub-postmaster had asked for the audit. It didn't matter if the sub-postmaster had been making complaints for weeks and months to the helpline or to his manager of a computer problem. If there was a shortfall that was not authorised, he was suspended.
That would have been the decision of the retail line manager.
No matter whose decision it was, that's what happened. Is that right? They were just suspended.
I don't know whether that happened on every occasion. I guess it would depend on each case.
Well, were you ever in, amongst the 1,400 audits that you conducted, a situation where a postmaster was saying, it's not me, it's the computer system? And the line manager said, well, hold on, this is a postmaster that, I don't know, has been working for us honestly for 20 years. we need to credit what he or she is saying. We need to conduct an investigation into whether what he says or she says is correct. Let's investigate whether or not what they say is accurate. And they weren't suspended, they were allowed to carry on working.
I can't recall any. I wouldn't have thought a retail line manager would discuss that with an auditor. I think an auditor just verified the things, the cash and the stock or discrepancies and passed it over. So you wouldn't particularly been involved in that side.
Did you ever hear, because you were standing there in the branch, it coming back from the line manager, let's not suspend them, let's investigate the merits of what they say?
No, I can't recall any.
So what do you guys think of Helen Rose's testimony about the suspension and audit process there, team?
It's like robots.
Yes.
It's like the
And
robots have taken over.
No presumption of good faith to go to the relational contract.
Exactly.
No presumption that these sub-postmasters might not be doing the right thing.
And presumably they were
doing the right
doing
thing.
some day after day and starting to stand with people. And I hate to do that thing where you're like, well, did they seem like robbers? But we're standing next to people who had invited them in some way, and we're standing there next to them being investigated, and then they're looking at the investigator going, can you figure it out? And the investigator didn't use the human part of their brain to go, this person seems as confused as, like, no critical thinking at all, and no using the human part of your brain. That's why I think it feels robotic. It's like, I did the number did X, and it's like, look up and over. What else can you see? It's lost kind of any context. Any context grounding.
Then what happens?
Well, so, like, the investigators, like, they think they're cops, but just to be clear, they also do not have any special qualifications or whatever. But they do a 3-week residential course, which is clearly, like, quite the course because they all talk about it. And, like, I feel like there must be a what goes on tour stays on tour vibe to that course. But they
3-week residential.
That's exactly.
a long time.
It really is. I'd like to see the proportion of relationships made.
Basically like learning profiling at Quantico.
Oh, is this your next?
No, I'm joking. That was clearly a joke. It did not land.
Sorry,
Right.
I take it it's longer than 3 weeks to learn profiling. I see this now. Right. Anyway, so these investigators go away on this 3-week course where they are introduced to what they call the PACE Act, which is like the Criminal Evidence Act or whatever. But these people have been trained to look for human error or fraud, right? And so they come along and they are like, okay, the money's missing, so clearly you took it. And they don't think, they're asked at various points in the inquiry, did you ever think the system was at fault? And they're like, no, like everyone told me the system was robust. Why would I think that? And then once they start hearing from postmasters that the system is an error, they're like, aha, these canny postmasters, they're just trying to blame the one thing that's left to them, and that's like a ruse. So they don't believe them. But if a sub-postmaster does assert a system error, the investigator will go to, remember there's 2 help desks run by 2 organisations.
Yep.
They will go to one of the 2 help desks. They might go to the Network Business Support Centre, the Post Office, or the Horizon Help Desk from Fujitsu. And the help desk will look at their files and they say, nothing here. Even if, as is the case in many of these cases, there are hundreds of calls made to the help desk from that branch. But when they say nothing here, they're like, well, we didn't find anything. See how that's a different question from whether there was something here. So there's a thing where the help desk then sort of say this very narrow thing where they're like, well, I can't see anything wrong with it. And in fact, Andy Wise, who's like an audit manager on the MBSC, says, we're a small cog. There was like suspense accounts, there was Horizon, there were area managers. We were just a small cog. So like within the scope of what MBSC could do, I'm saying I couldn't see anything. So he's not saying, in fact, if you ask him, that everything was fine. He's just saying, I couldn't see it. But he says that back to the investigators, and the investigators are like, brilliant. Tick. Everything is fine. Not just in this one bit, but like the whole thing is completely fine.
So we're not really investigating?
No, because there's no problem with it. Why would you investigate? So then the investigators, having got their confirmation that everything's fine, they then make a recommendation to a legal area. So here's your check and balance, Alison. They all make a really big point that it goes off to the lawyers, and the lawyers have to recommend prosecution. Now, of course, when the inquiry asks the lawyers about it, they say, did you ever not agree with the recommendation made by the investigators? What do you think?
Never is my guess.
And on what basis do you think they didn't, like, why did they justify this? How can they justify always agreeing?
I'm assuming they didn't say to the court lack of curiosity.
No, they did not say that. What do you think they said? I love that this has stumped you. They said, I don't know the details of the case. They know the details of the case.
Of course.
Who am I to offer it?
Yeah.
I'm just a lawyer sitting in an office a million miles away. How would I know?
Of course.
But again, where's the... so then the issue here is also whose neck's on the line, because if the lawyer's neck was on the line individually for keeping that moving when there's clearly a systemic error, and I'm curious to know how many lawyers, God bless their socks, there were involved in the sense of whether how much could they see what was going on. But there was clearly no concern that if the details in that investigation were wrong, there would be any particular problem or consequence for them.
Yes, absolutely no concern. There were actually only, for the vast majority of this time, like 2 lawyers involved, because they didn't, here's another great separation, they just sign off on the prosecution, but because of funding cuts in post, they send it off to a completely independent third-party lawyer out in Manchester. They seem to be a lot of them, or whatever. So, like, you've got this kind of chain of people getting further and further from the original event. They've had no contact. None of these people along the chain have had any contact with the original criminal, and they're all just relying on this report written by this one auditor at the beginning of the day back in the thing.
It's not an auditor.
It's not an auditor.
He's a stock take clerk.
And we shall say that forever. And of course, then the outsourced lawyers begin their process of building an affirmative case for false accounting. And remember, actually, it was really easy to build a case for false accounting because in many cases, the people had committed false accounting by saying the thing has balanced so they could roll over to the next month, remember? So if it said it was in deficit, if they didn't put the $60,000 physically into the till and said we can roll over, they had committed false accounting. So they'd go off and get their prosecution.
After calling the help desk to figure out what was wrong.
100 times, yeah. So, look, you get to the prosecution phase, and sometimes if the sub-postmaster has a really good lawyer, they might force Post Office to look at the Fujitsu data a bit better. And this doesn't happen very often because Post Office has to pay to get the Fujitsu data, and they ration themselves about how much data they want to get. So they only do it if they're really forced to it.
Hilarious.
So, but even
Have you never seen that though? I mean, that, yeah.
I mean, of course I have, but yep.
But not in a criminal prosecution. That's you've never seen that in a prosecution.
No, sorry. I more meant the having to pay for effectively your own information.
Yeah.
Like,
I have definitely seen that. Yes. But so in this case, even when they get to, like the lawyer is saying, the sub-postmaster defence lawyer is saying, actually there's a problem with the system. I assert there is a problem with the system. Fujitsu need to tell us. Even that doesn't work to reverse the onus of proof. And so here's my classic case of how this operates in practice. Gareth Jenkins, who is a Fujitsu engineer about whom we will do a whole episode because he is a very special case, he says at the most notorious criminal trial, look, I've reviewed the 500,000 transactions in the 12 months at Ms. Misra's post office, right? Like I've looked at them. I couldn't see anything that suggested to me that there was a system failing, but I couldn't do a more detailed review because the defence didn't tell me specific instances where things had gone wrong or exactly what I should be looking for.
It's not their job. Except it is in this bullshit private prosecution, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, not in a criminal prosecution,
Obviously.
but this idea that you need to tell me more so I can understand my system problem doesn't feel super far away.
Mm-hmm.
And people often come in with a complaint that's very vibey, that's very lacking in detail. It's very my kid is unhappy in this situation, so therefore you must be doing something wrong. Okay, well, what is that thing that we are doing wrong that is making your child unhappy? Well, they're unhappy.
Yeah.
They're unhappy.
Yeah.
Therefore,
the teachers mean...
You must be doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do complaints without detail. But then are we pushing people out when we require the detail? Like I know we had a lot of, whenever I built complaint systems, a lot of push-pull on, must you write it down? Must you provide all your details? Can it be done on the phone? And so do you have to give us dates? And so in some ways it's, and the motivation is, well, I know I won't be able to progress a complaint without you naming the hospital that you're talking about. Or so people often want to get their complaint out. I was at a hospital and I had this terrible experience, et cetera, but they don't want to tell you who it was because they don't want their local doctor to find out. They don't want any blowback on themselves. They give you half the details. And it's very hard to do anything when you only got half the details. Equally, the more you ask of a complainant, the less likely it is that complaint will ever get anywhere because their capacity to deliver on your forensic requirements for dates and times and what was the name of the nurse? I don't know. She was just really mean.
Yep.
Is real like it it's a tension for it's a
and
tension
it seems
though.
like you're being interrogated if you are the complainant, right?
Yes.
Well, Alison, tell me specifically when and where and how and who and it feels like you're not being believed.
And often
It
just when
does.
you say it out loud, out of context, it sounds not quite right. Like he spoke sharply to my child with autism at lunchtime. Sounds like, well, you know, he used a cross voice, but you're like, no, we've talked about this like 100 times. When he uses that voice, he knows that it sets this thing off and then blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, without context, when you ask people to be very specific, it can sound, you can feel even as you're saying it that it's not like, I don't know, you feel
And
a
it's
bit
also
gaslit.
just really hard to progress anything without details. But then also the asking of it gives you that gaslit feeling of, right, so you don't believe me unless I can tell you what day it happened, or you can't believe me unless I've got a receipt, or so again it goes back to that assumption of lack of good faith that a complainant is not that they're dysregulated or they're not approaching you in good faith because they can't provide the full picture, particularly when the full picture isn't available to you. And often when you interact with government, you don't have – that is the blurry part about it, is you don't have your own file or you don't have the same information that the government's got. So I think it's a hard one to nail and balance correctly. This is clearly an example of getting it really wrong.
Well, that's true. But I think the Gareth Jenkins evidence actually shows this dynamic perfectly, because when I first heard him say...
Did he really read 500? Did he really read 500,000 transactions?
Well, that's when he said it. I was like...
I know, he said it. I'm like, really? I know I'm not like a details person and I do like my ideas done larger than that, but did he really read 500,000 transactions?
Well, because my takeaway was actually it is a bit unreasonable to ask him to read 500,000 transactions, so I can sort of see how he got there. But then counsel assisting Mr. Beer, who is just like superb, and yes, his name is Mr. Beer, takes him through the many places that he could have gone to work out where to look that didn't rely on Ms. Misra telling him. So he's like, well, did you look at the call logs of Ms. Misra and try to cross-reference the times of those call logs and what she's saying in those call logs with what's happening? And he's like, nope. And she's like, did you look at when the hardware failure happened? We know that's a point at which software, blah, blah, blah. Nope. Did you look at the known error logs in Fujitsu that captured known system errors at that time? And he's like, oh, no, I definitely didn't look at those because they didn't relate to her branch. They related to other branches. And you're like, but what if they did? Did you look at other incidents happening at other branches and around the same? No, didn't. So it's like he showed no curiosity. He showed none of that extra step. He was just like, I look at it, all kind of looks fine, and that was it. So that, my friends, is how you reverse the onus of proof. Every area that is asked about, is the system working fine, either asserts very confidently that there's nothing wrong, like the help desks, or they say, oh, how can I know? I'm not an expert. I've been told there's nothing wrong. And no one goes and does the next step. They then go to court and say very expansively, there is nothing wrong with the system. And the sub-postmaster is left in this kind of position where they're like, but excuse me, that's how you do it?
I can't imagine the experience of being a sub-postmaster in all of this. It just would have been almost surreal, I think.
They seem, I mean, you can see them now, like they've kind of formed this cohort and they're doing speaking tours and stuff, and it is like they were gaslit for 20 years, right? Like, so angry now at post office, like they find it, like you can just see there's this visceral anger at having been ignored.
Yeah.
We also do this in the reverse though, right? So this is about how do you find the system problem. And I'm working in a big system at the moment where they've identified a couple of problems because a couple of people said it was a problem. And it's such a common thing to have happen, particularly in large systems, and by that I don't need to be like, health, education,
jails.
They're big. Yep. They're big systems, right? And so a couple of not users of the system, people in the public service have said, oh, it's a problem, because I've been places and 2 people have told me, and they want to start fixing it straight away. And working through that process of, do we know if it's a problem before we start committing resources to it? Is it a system problem? Is it just this site's problem? Is it an issue that is it a training issue? And not to gaslight back in the reverse direction, but we do the same thing in the other way around, which is we hear everything in isolation and sometimes run off and act to solve things that aren't even a problem because we didn't do the thing of stepping back and going.
We apply a system solve for a site problem. And then
all the time.
Yeah.
All the time? I don't feel like all the time. I feel like
occasionally.
Yeah, I feel like that pathology exists in some public service organisations and the post office pathology exists in other...
Some public service leaders.
Yeah, okay. I think the real question is how are we identifying system problems and how do we hear people and how do we hear the right people, and we can do it badly in both directions,
Yes.
One of which is we can miss the systems problems, and other times we can be told by someone who sounds really convincing that this is a terrible problem and start working very hard on solving it and then discover that in fact it's actually like not really a problem.
So
Especially
the thing that gets me here, indeed, about both Robodebt and Post Office is surely at some point there should have been like a volume trigger. Right? Like the volume of cases that were going to the AAT, or in this case, the volume of the prosecutions, like at some point, someone had to go, this seems like a lot more than usual. How was that not enough for people to notice? Or were they doing it on purpose?
So this is going to be the subject of our next episode, Alison, because there is a theory put forward by many of the completely rightly aggrieved sub-postmasters that this was a shakedown, right? Like Robodebt, which was actively a shakedown, this prosecution practice was about ensuring the post office could keep its bottom line by shaking people down for debts. I don't buy it. Like, I really don't buy it, because in this case, it actually just wasn't that much money. Like, it's, 1,000 people, they all owe kind of £10,000. Like, it's not enough money to pay the salaries of all the people who we've just talked about who are operating for 20 years to kind of keep this system going. For me, I think this is much more like one of those, like Danielle said it before with the robot thing. It's like there's this zombie function of prosecution, and it just keeps doing the thing. It audits, investigates, refers for prosecution, prosecuting, and it just keeps doing the thing over and over and over again, irrespective of facts and circumstances that don't fit the operation. And there is literally no better example of this than in 2013, they actually stopped prosecutions. When we get to the Gareth Jenkins evidence, I'll talk about why. They stopped prosecutions because of problems with Gareth Jenkins' evidence. They can't use his evidence anymore. They have to find another expert, and they never can. So they stopped prosecutions, but every other step in the process continues. They continue to have a fully staffed...
This is what happened with Robodebt.
So they can, even after, of course, yes, once they stopped, that's right, they stopped sending out the final letter, but they kept all that. Yeah, it's exactly like that.
They just stopped sending out the last letter and hoped that everyone would pay on letters 1 to 7 or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly right. So look, I am hoping we can talk about this dynamic of systems that just keep on going in our next episode.
Excellent. Till next time.
My thinking lately, with everything that's going on, has been around the post office has had this contract, we say, for 300 years. That's as long as post office has existed. It was a very archaic contract and very harsh on postmasters. And what I tend to think about is at what point that should have changed. Should that have been in the 90s? Should that have been in 2006? Should that have been in 2019 when things did change because of the group litigation? So I tend to reflect more on that to try and rationalise in my own head at what point it was appropriate to stop being like that. And I don't know if that was in 2006 when they were pursuing Mr. Castleton for this. Certainly thinking back now, it feels very harsh. And like you said, he was crying out for help. He were making calls in there, and regardless of the reason for the loss, my view looking back is post office should and could have intervened sooner rather than later and let it get to where it's at.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.